Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, everyone. So yes, my name is Matthew James Gray. I'm one of the lecturers here at Tabor. Let me just press F5 to get this going. There we go. My computer's being a bit silly. There we go. Primarily, when you're talking about the claim that Christianity is anti-art or anything like that, it's primarily an argument levelled against Christians from the 3rd and 4th centuries. It's primarily based around the destruction of pagan temples and things like that after Constantine. Now, I've had a look around, and to be honest, it's kind of hard to find published articles or books by scholars on this topic, particularly, especially among art historians. You don't see it that much. There are a variety of unqualified atheist websites that are out there, and I want to stress, I'm not saying that because they're unqualified they're inherently wrong. You know, it's just that they don't represent the mainstream academic view. The most powerful published book on the topic that does really try to hammer this idea is actually one that came out this year, and that's called The Darkening Age by Catherine Nixey. I will mention that, just to be honest, Nixey isn't actually an historian as such. She did do some study at Cambridge University in classical society, which puts classical society is what we often call like the Greco-Roman period. So she has studied that period, but she's not so much an historian as a journalist. And I'll also add, I've seen some reviews of her book that are in, say, popular newspapers or things like that, but none within scholarly academic journals. Now, 4 stars. Yeah, she got real 5 stars on Amazon, and if you judge it based on Amazon, then she's really, really impressive. But I haven't seen any academic journals dealing with it. Now, to be fair, it only came out this year, so, you know, it could be that we're just waiting on that. It could be that. Alternatively, and in my opinion, the reason why you don't see much direct academic engagement with this kind of stuff is respectfully because I think she and those like her on the interweb are just way off base. Like, just way off base. Now, you know, I want to recognise I'm not an art historian, and I'm certainly not an artist. My 3-year-old does better finger painting than me, okay? And I'll say that my PhD research is in the early modern period, not the classical Greco-Roman period, although, on the other hand, I have looked quite extensively at the history of art, fairly broadly, including Greco-Roman art, as part of my role here as a lecturer at Tabor, and have lectured in the classical period and early church history professionally here. So let me try to explain Nixey and other atheists' position. Now, it's important to realise that their position is actually a deconstructionist position. Now, what that means is they're deconstructing another position. Okay, so in order to understand their perspective, you have to actually look at what they're deconstructing. You have to look at the perspective behind it. You have to look at the earlier view that was prevailing, that they're refuting. And it all comes down to the transition from paganism to Christianity. From a traditional, especially Christian view, but not exclusively Christian by any means, Christians were a persecuted minority within the Greco-Roman world that eventually found favour with a benevolent emperor, Constantine, who then rejected the long-standing status quo of pagan deity worship. This in time led to him and other Roman emperors supporting Christianity to the point where Christians were able to dismantle many expressions of pagan power in the empire, including their art, and to even take over previous pagan temples and turn them into churches. Now, there's one major imperial exception, and that's the Emperor Julian, commonly referred to as Julian the Apostate. Any of you guys ever heard of Julian the Apostate? Right, great. Who rejected Christianity and sought to return the empire to paganism, but who ultimately died in battle against the Persians before he could really get that going very far. Subsequently, the empire returned immediately to Christianity, and that was that. So that's a fairly mainstream way of looking at it. Nixie and co. take that same information and portray that story in a starkly different way. They argue that Christians, they weren't some, meek little persecuted group or anything like that, but they were a public menace. And that's why the government harassed them. Okay? Part of that was that they attacked Greco-Roman paganism, which actually, as far as Nixie and co. Are concerned, had a lot going for it. It was actually awesome. Not least of that was the magnificent art that they created, such as like the idols in their great temples for, Zeus or whoever. The other reason that they argue that Greco-Roman paganism was so wonderful was because it was pluralistic. So the Romans very rarely suppressed any kind of religion. Okay? So what would happen is that they would march into a town and they've taken it over and that kind of thing. And they'd come to whoever was left out of the city or whatever that they hadn't conquered, and the people would say, "We'll die before we give in to you guys. We're not giving up our culture and we're not giving up all of our gods and that kind of thing for your stinking Roman gods because we just fought you and that kind of thing." And then what the Romans would do is the Romans would say to them, hey, no one's saying you have to give up your gods. In fact, your gods sound kind of cool. Tell us a little bit more about them. And then they'd say things like, I can imagine that. I can imagine you're the vanquished nation and you're going, well, we do have this god called Artemis and she's pretty awesome. And they go, really? Oh, she sounds fascinating. Tell me more, tell me more. And as they, would bring that out, the Romans would say, you know what? She sounds so fabulous. I tell you what, why don't we make a temple for her back in Rome? We'll pay for the whole thing. That kind of stuff. And like you can imagine from the nation, it's like, our little god's going big time. This is really cool. And off it would go. This was a fundamental way that the Romans were able to conquer so much because they integrated new gods into their system. Okay? New religions were integrated alongside the existing ones and thus were rarely suppressed or attacked by the existing religions. The only ones that were attacked were those that posed a threat to the state, such as when Judaism became violently tied with Palestinian independence from the empire, a pesky thing called the Jewish War, or Christianity, which had a kind of our way or no way attitude. As well as that, atheists like Nixie argue that Christians were antagonistic to both the other gods and to their articles of worship, such as idols, primarily because of that pesky second commandment, which all the Christians in the room know is you don't have any graven images. That's really bad. Right? And so, as soon as the Christians got the chance, they said, A, we don't like the religion that these people represent, the Greco-Roman pagan religion, and B, we don't like that they're using idols. Let's smash them and be done with them. Okay? Atheists like Nixie even cite examples from the New Testament, such as the destruction of magic books worth a lot of money in Ephesus in Acts 19. You familiar with that story? We'll look at it a little bit later. Basically, the story is Paul goes into Ephesus, converts a lot of people, and it literally says, like, they got a pile of books worth effectively millions of dollars, and burned them in the middle of the city. Right? This, therefore, indicates that Christians were anti-classical Greco-Roman religion, art, and literature. I mean, just like, Christians were really horrible with this kind of stuff. I mean, look what they did, when they destroyed the Library of Alexandria. Just a little bit of a fun joke because that's what I absolutely hammered last time I was speaking here. Right? And this is really helpful to remember, the central criticisms are that Christianity was and is anti-pagan and anti-art. So it's not just about us being anti-art. It's also about us being anti-pagan religion more generally. Okay? Others on the internet identify more examples of this among Christians in more recent history, thus painting a picture, pardon the pun, of the anti-art thing being a tendency across Christianity. So it's not just an early church thing. It's a thing that this is what Christians do. Namely, they identify anti-art tendencies within some of the 17th century reformers, such as Zwingli in Zurich, who famously blacked out the stained glass windows in the Zurich chapel and, smashed all of their, statues of saints and stuff like that. Well, except he didn't actually do that. There were people adamantly within Zurich and in wider Protestantism, including within Lutheranism, that were adamantly looking to destroy all those things. But Luther and Zwingli refused to do so. Zwingli ultimately sought to have a compromise, and that compromise was he would put curtains over the statues, and like I said, he didn't smash the windows, he blacked them out because he realised it might come back to bite him a little later if they destroyed, stained glass windows that were hundreds of years old and actually were really wonderful and stuff like that. Anyway, even so, some people argue that the reformers perpetuated an anti-artistic culture. Another example, sometimes mentioned, is this. It's the destruction of the photo Piss Christ by Andre Serrano in 2011. It was on display at Avignon. So if you don't know, Serrano's Piss Christ is actually a picture of a plastic crucifix that has been immersed in Serrano's own urine, and then he took a picture. And some people felt that this was offensive. You've got to wonder why. But they thought it was really offensive, and so what they did is they attacked that picture, and subsequently that copy of the picture was destroyed. Having said that, he kept the negatives, and so it was fine, and we still have that picture today. So having kind of articulated all of that, I have to admit I find this whole line of argument somewhat frustrating. I could start to unpack many of the specifics in their argument in Nixie's book and things like that, but if I did that, it'd become incredibly nitpicky, and I don't think you guys would have any fun with this conversation, this talk at all. You don't come out on a Thursday evening for me to pick apart every finer detail of every single example. Instead, let me take you through a broad, more holistic understanding of Christianity's relationship to Greco-Roman religion, and then discuss its relationship to art. Now, on one level, let me just concede it already. During the early church period, after Constantine, Christians did destroy any number of pagan temples. I'm going to admit that right out the bat. But if we first of all, just look at that as being wrong, And we'll look at the reasons for that in a little while. But even if we say that was wrong, let's take that pile and then let's take the pile of art that Christians have created since then in things like the Renaissance and that kind of stuff, and see how we stack up. To kind of lay my cards on the table a little, and to prove that pictures paint 1,000 words, can I just say this? This is the Christo Pantocrata. It's bigger than this room, wider than this room. That's from the 12th century in Cefalu, Italy. Or this, Matthias Grunewald, the small crucifixion, which is one of the most remarkable, in terms of its artistic ability, it's just what it conveys, what it can... entire art courses are dedicated to things like this, right? Or this. This is Christ, the Alpha and Omega. This is from the 4th century catacombs, right? Now, admittedly, it's not stood the test of time, but, it's faded and everything like that. But Christians seem to like their art a bit more than we would assume. And then, just because it's a cheap shot, but it's a good shot, there's the Sistine Chapel. One of the finest expressions of art on a large scale that at the same time as it is both huge. It's a big build, it's a chapel. It's pretty big. As well as that, it manages to be both huge and intimately detailed. There's an intimacy to it in terms of the level of detail down to the finest level. And I might add this. This is by Sandro Botticelli, and it was done in the 1480s. This is not a Christian scene. Now look, if I'd wanted to, I could have shown you Raphael, and Raphael went nuts with Christian themes all the time. That was his big thing. Right? But this is Botticelli. Botticelli adamantly painted, frequently painted Christian religious art. But he also painted this, which is the birth of Venus. This is pagan, and very specific pagan. This is Greco-Roman pagan. And you know who paid him to do that? The church. The church paid him to do that. Okay. Actually, the Medici family, who were going to become popes. Okay. And then there's this. This is a statue, and the statue is Apollo and Daphne. It is 243 centimetres high. This is by Bernini from 1622. It is undeniably a masterpiece of Baroque sculpture, and the person who paid him to do that was a cardinal. Bernini would go on to become the papal artist, the official artist for the Pope. And look, the fact is I don't have time to show you all the paintings, all the sculptures during, say, the Renaissance or the neoclassical period, a revival of Greco-Roman art, architecture, sculpture in the 1700s, 1800s, which emerged, guess where? Out of Rome. Adamantly promoted by Christians there. Now, it kind of got weighed up with the French Revolution and it gets a bit funky from there, but simply put, the evidence to suggest that Christianity is passionately supportive of the arts far, far, far outweighs any evidence to say that we destroy it. Such claims fail to the point of embarrassment for atheists. To my atheist friends, let me say, you've got better arguments. you've got much better arguments. You've got arguments that make me go, whoo, go to those. Right? As for the relationship between Christianity and Greco-Roman paganism, as can be seen by Apollo and Daphne and the birth of Venus and those kind of things, I think we have to recognise that it is far, far more nuanced than is being portrayed by atheists here. The relationship between Christianity and Greco-Roman paganism isn't a hard and fast thing, right? There's something going on here that means any simplistic reductionism to Christians don't like the pagan gods just doesn't stack up. Like, seriously, go and do a Google image search for all of the Christian artists who spend an awful lot of time painting pictures and doing sculptures of what we would, commonly call Greek mythological stuff. And it's a fair bit. Okay? The evidence is overwhelming that the relationship between Christianity and Greco-Roman paganism is far more complicated than any reduction to Christians just hated pagans. So, to kind of unpack what that is, let's start by returning to the conversion of the Roman Empire. Actually, let's go back to that example mentioned from the Bible, and that's Acts 19. By the way, this is Massari 1612's painting of St. Paul burning pagan books in Ephesus, itself a masterpiece. When you actually look at the wider context underneath that culture, underneath that chapter, Acts 19, what you discover is that the people burning the books were not Paul or long-standing Christians. Have any of you guys read that recently? When you look at it, it's not actually Paul or long-standing Christians burning those books. You know why? Because there aren't any long-standing Christians in Ephesus at this point. No. The people who are actually burning all of these books are the local populace. Okay? The local populace who have lived in Ephesus their entire lives. And the reason they did that was because they felt that Christianity had liberated them. Now, from what depends on your perspective. It's either liberated them from superstition or liberated them from demonic oppression. Now, if you're a modernist, you're going to say the demonic one's probably silly, but from their point of view, they certainly felt that they had been under demonic oppression throughout, or spiritual oppression, if you like, throughout a long period, and Christianity had liberated them. This is actually indicative of the wider thing going on during this period. Christianity did not so much oppress paganism into submission. Pagan religion was already being entirely rejected by a large proportion of the Greco-Roman populace who felt it was corrupt and oppressive. Christianity didn't come in and steal it, okay? Like steal the pagan populace from pagan religion. They were leaving anyway. The divorce papers were in the mail, and then they went to Christianity, right? Now, what was it that made it feel so oppressive? Well, funnily enough, it was actually partially the very pluralism that had made it attractive to begin with. That pluralism, where any god was okay, just became utterly untenable. Most historians have identified that. If you're running around saying, any old god will do, that does not engender a sense that it's a coherent narrative. It's convenient, because everyone gets along for a while, but when you're actually starting to die, you're asking yourself questions like, which god, when I die, is really going to be on the top dog there that I'm actually going to be alongside with? Which one of the worldviews in which this god lives, or that god, is actually going to help me out? Are any of them? Do any of them care? People had grown increasingly incredulous of the whole thing, particularly from an afterlife perspective. Moreover, if we're willing to actually listen and take seriously pre-modern people's perspectives, their own perspectives, right? the Greco-Roman populace strongly experienced all this paganism as demonic oppression. That was one of the reasons they began to embrace Christianity. Now, you might think that they were nuts. You might think that they were superstitious morons. But from their perspective, they emphatically believed that all of these gods and everything had become a demonic force in their life and were counterproductive to a healthy lifestyle. A central facet of the rite of baptism by this point, for example, was being anointed with exorcism oil. Why? Why would they do that? Because they don't want the gods and the wider spiritual forces in their culture to actually oppress them anymore. And they see Christianity as a way of liberating them from that oppression. Okay? Now, atheists might balk that people thought like that, but you can't say that they were forcefully made to reject paganism. No, the prime reason that some Christians attacked pagan buildings and pagan art was because they themselves had recently rejected paganism to become Christians, and their conversion had empowered them to attack their identified symbols of oppression. I'm reminded of, do you remember when Saddam Hussein lost the war? And do you remember that scene where there were some Iraqis who went and smashed the living daylights out of a bust of him, like a big statue of him? Right? Now, you could argue that that's a horrific attack on art. Or you could argue it's people expressing that they are now free from an oppressor. That's more the feel I get from this. Okay? When Constantine had become emperor, Christianity had represented just over 10% of the empire's entire population, and had recently gone through a vicious persecution thanks to the previous two emperors. Even with Constantine's help, they were in no position to impose themselves on 90% of the population. If the wider Roman populace hadn't wanted to leave paganism to become Christian, it just wouldn't have happened. They left because what the traditional Greco-Roman religion had become just sucked. It just sucked, right? This is further seen when we return to the atheist poster boy in this whole thing, Julian. Central to Julian's attempts to revive paganism was an attempt to effectively Christianize it. He desperately tried to get pagan priests, temples, etc., to try to act just like the Christians had, right? Serving the local populace instead of exploiting them. Leo Donald Davis stated, Julian attempted as well to reform the pagan priesthoods, preaching them sermons on austerity, kindness to the unfortunate, fraternity, and devotion to the instruction of people. Pagan priests were enjoined to stay out of taverns and avoid jobs base and unworthy of their calling. Money from the imperial treasury was distributed to the pagan priests for the establishment of charitable institutions in imitation of Christians. Okay? This, tells you a lot about what people thought of Christianity, but it actually also tells you what pagan religion actually was like. And it was not perceived by the populace themselves as being some wonderful, liberating cultural thing that made them just feel happy, scrappy, and wonderful. Right? It wasn't selling. Right? And what was the response of the Roman populace to all this? Well, Davis continues. But as the emperor, shabbily dressed and wearing the wispy beard and long hair of a philosopher, sacrificed beasts and sprinkled incense, the masses remained indifferent or mocked his dogged seriousness. So let's just unpack this for a minute. The narrative of the atheists seemed to be Christians came in and the massive pagans, the Greco-Roman populace went, I don't want to be Christian. I want to stay pagan and I want to worship Zeus and stuff like that. Why won't you let me worship them and that kind of thing? And the Christians came in and went, no, we're destroying your temples. This kind of stuff, right? But Julian gives us clear evidence that when they were under absolutely no pressure from Christians, And the government was actually adamantly investing tons of money and resources to promoting paganism. As soon as they could get back to Christianity, the entire populace went nuts. Why? Right? Because they really didn't like it anymore. Yet, here's where it gets really interesting. What is astonishing is that Christianity was actually able to revive an appreciation of the best of the Greco-Roman pagan religion. They did it. Christians did it. Admittedly, it took a little while. G.K. Chesterton, himself a journalist and a bit of a classical historian, really helps here. He wrote copiously about the problems with paganism in books like The Everlasting Man, which everyone should read because it's awesome. There, Chesterton posited that Greco-Roman paganism had been its subtext had been balancing three key instincts that everyone has in their philosophy or their spirituality. Those are imaginative idealism, rationalism, or logic and stuff like that, and vicious pragmatism. Let me say those again. Imaginative idealism, rationalism, and vicious pragmatism. So the imaginative idealism was best seen in the Greek mythology we'd be most familiar with, Apollo, Zeus, Hercules, that kind of stuff. The rationalism came out in philosophy, such as Plato, Aristotle, etc. And the pragmatics emerged through the darker elements of Greco-Roman pagan religion, such as political and demonic oppression. Eventually, within the empire, pragmatics won out over the other two, and then it became oppressive. That's when Christianity actually kicked in. This point was further elaborated in Chesterton's biography of Francis of Assisi, which is just a beautiful book, where he describes how the 1100s saw a massive revival in interest for Greco-Roman classics, Western art, and nature itself. This is an extremely useful excerpt for us to look at, and this is what he argued. He argued that this classical revival in the 1100s was the end of a penance, or if it be preferred, a purgation. What were they purging? It marked the moment when a certain spiritual expiation and emptying had been finally worked out and certain spiritual diseases had been finally expelled from the system. Christianity had entered the world to cure the world, and she cured it in the only way in which it could be cured. Viewed merely in an external and experimental fashion, the whole of the high civilization of antiquity, which Greco-Roman period, had ended in the learning of a certain lesson, that is, in its conversion to Christianity. Now, I need to stress here, Chesterton thought extremely highly of classical Greco-Roman civilization. He's not bagging it at all. He goes on. That pagan civilization had indeed been a very high civilization. It would not weaken our thesis, it might even strengthen it, to say that it was the highest that humanity ever reached. It had discovered its still unrivaled arts of poetry and plastic representation. It had discovered its own permanent political ideals. It had discovered its own clear system of logic and language. But above all, it had discovered its own mistake. So what was the mistake? That mistake was too deep to be ideally defined. The shorthand of it is to call it the mistake of nature worship. It might almost as truly be called the mistake of being natural, and it was a very natural mistake. The Greeks, the great guides and pioneers of pagan antiquity, started out with the idea of something splendidly obvious and direct. The idea that if a man walked straight ahead on the high road of reason and nature, he would come to no harm, especially if he was, as the Greek was, eminently enlightened and intelligent. But Chesterton argued that the Greeks and Romans had, by the time of Constantine, discovered the logical end of much of their pagan religion. They'd walked the straight line for so long that they actually saw where it was taking them, and they didn't like it. It was not so much that the pagan world was wicked, as that it was good enough to realise that its paganism was becoming wicked. Or rather, it was on the logical high road to wickedness. I mean, that there was no future for natural magic. They'd run out. To deepen it was only to darken it into black magic. There was no future for it, because in the past it had only been innocent because it was so young. We might say it had only been innocent because it was shallow. Pagans were wiser than paganism. That is why the pagans became Christians. Do you see where he's going here? They had come to the point where they understood the logic of where it was taking them, their paganism was taking them, and they didn't like it. And that's when they went to Christianity. Right? Let me unpack that for you. The sense of the gods interacting with the world. Let's start with that. Because they didn't have a God who was so much transcendent as a God intricately tied to nature. So think Neptune. Neptune's the god of the sea, for example. Okay. What this meant was that their gods were fundamentally entwined with brutal naturalism, whereby the capricious, often cruel actions of nature, a flood or other catastrophe, for example, were seen to be the acts of capricious, cruel gods, and this in turn became a justification for people, especially those in leadership positions, to be cruel and capricious themselves. The cruelest, most shocking impulses of human nature, Chesterton uses sexual exploitation as his own example, were now only justified by the stories within the pagan religion, not refuted by them. To the point where the actual pagan religion and all of the great morals of it had been so twisted by what had happened to the religion that the religion itself seemed totally irredeemable. So they dumped it. And they dumped it for something that was clearly otherworldly. Okay, something that said that on one hand, yes, you have got a God who comes into the world, but he is from out of the world. And he brings the justice and the goodness and all of that kind of stuff from that into the world now. Okay? He is not the God of the sea in that sense. He is not entwined with the sea. Okay, those kind of things. They dumped it and they went cold turkey on nature and paganism almost entirely, especially in Western Europe. It was only after they had had time, about half a millennium, to expunge the unhealthy aspects of all that stuff, that they could return to it with fresh eyes. And when that happened, Christianity encouraged them to do so, which is why you get the flourishing of art that we've talked about. Right? That's why you see the flourishing of art, philosophy, architecture, nature that occurred in the 12th and 13th centuries in Western Europe and more broadly. Christianity recognised that behind the stories, when they could be viewed healthily, were key universal ideals, standards, values, right? And that thus the heroic deeds of Achilles or whoever would inspire people to be good human beings. Now, those stories didn't need to necessarily be historically or spiritually factual stories about Hero or Diana or whatever. Coupled alongside Christianity, they could stand as fables, metaphors. They could stand as narratives representing universally recognised ideals, ideals such as justice, heroism, compassion, nobility, courage, much like, for example, superheroes are often used that way today. And so that's exactly what the Christians encouraged, right up to the Renaissance and into the neoclassical period. Right. Do you see where I'm going? Do you see what I'm saying there? Okay. They recognised that these things represented standards, good standards, when they had just lost all of the icky old yuckiness that had been there at the end of the pagan era. Once you could purge that stuff out of it, that the pagans didn't want anymore anyway, you could actually find something good to play with in that, which is why you get those kind of things. Because you know the other really important value, standard that they identified? Beauty. Okay, Venus is beautiful. That's an ideal that she represents in, Greco-Roman religion, but also within art. And they realised that God is a God of beauty, who loves beauty and things like that. And so it made sense. Now, I want to stress, so far I've primarily focused on the western side of Europe. But from an artistic point of view, the other side of Europe, namely the Eastern Orthodox, is even more emphatically supportive of art. This is an icon of St. Luke. This is an icon of St. Luke painting an icon, right? That's because within the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the practice of artistically representing key Christian figures, not least of all Jesus and Mary, is something that they identify with Luke himself, right? Okay. The Eastern Orthodox are emphatically supportive of art. The claim that Christians are somehow anti-art because they see it as idolatrous would make many of our Greek and Russian Orthodox brothers and sisters burst out laughing. I mean, how many of you guys have ever been to an Orthodox church building? Tell them that Christians don't like art. Go right ahead, see how that goes down for you. I mean, most Orthodox church buildings that I've been have some of the most beautiful, elaborate art you could possibly imagine, right? They are also profoundly traditional, and their love of art is intrinsically tied up into their history and heritage. It goes a long way. I've got to tell you, I find the whole atheist accusation that Christians are anti-art to not only be rather anachronistic, disregarding of people's cultures from another time, but also profoundly ethnocentric. Profoundly ethnocentric, disregarding of a massive swathe of other cultures that are still alive even today. Now, if we are talking about the Orthodox, it is true that they had a period of what we call iconoclasm. Right? Iconoclasm. Iconoclasm is anti-icons, anti-art, back in the mid-700s. But that actually serves only to prove my point. By the 700s, icons were an integral part of the Byzantine worship and spirituality. Then around this time, the 700s, there emerged iconoclastic bishops in Asia Minor, primarily citing, unsurprisingly, the second commandment, forbidding of idols, or, as you know, from Deuteronomy chapter 5. In fact, by the reign of Emperor Leo III, who was from 717 to 741, he reigned then, these theologians had royalty on their side. Leo was certain that God was angry at the Byzantines for their increased use of icons. After all, Leo wasn't just an emperor. He had previously been a soldier. And he had the best evidence that God didn't like people using icons. And that was the amount of times he lost to Muslims. So it made perfect sense. Muslims didn't like images. The Christians did. And at that point, the Christians were losing. So clearly, what is that telling you? All right? In 725, Leo began and issued a logos, an official decree, about icons. Pope Gregory responded by refusing to pay his taxes to Leo, and there's more to that story, and issued a letter claiming not only that icons were perfectly legitimate, but that the emperor had no ecclesiastical authority to stop people using icons anyway. Leo didn't like that. But anyway, around 731, Leo fired the Patriarch Germanus, the Patriarch of Constantinople, the leader of the church in the East, because he was an iconophile. He liked icons. And he replaced him with Anastasius, who didn't like icons. Right? Leo then ordered his soldiers to desecrate an ancient icon of Christ on the city gate of Constantinople, and that didn't go down well. Riots ensued. When Leo died in 741, his son, Constantine V, called in the Byzantine tradition Constantine the Persecutor, began to take up from where he left off. Unfortunately, Constantine was able to perform the best PR trick in Byzantine politics. He was able to win against Muslims. And so he was able to start to say to people, see, we got rid of all of these icons, now we're beating the Muslims. See, God's back on our side. In 754, he called the Council of Herrera, where 338 bishops, all of them handpicked by him, vehemently condemned icons, and they called that the Seventh Ecumenical Council. No one calls it the Seventh Ecumenical Council now, okay? Yet throughout this period, there were several Greek theologians who came to prominence about this issue, and one of the most notable ones is this guy, John of Damascus. John of Damascus argued several things. One, he argued that icons are not idols. Everybody agreed that an idol actually takes on some sort of spiritual nature of what it represents, right? So an idol is something that actually imbibes the power of that which it represents, okay? But iconophiles were adamant that this was not happening in an icon. An icon represented a spiritual reality, but it represented it. It symbolised it. It didn't actually have it in itself. It was thus primarily for meditation and reflection. The issue also came down, obviously, to the actual purpose of the second commandment. Why? When God condemned images, why? If it was because it was just intrinsically wrong to put God in an image because, say, it limits our perception of who he is, then fine, the iconoclasts had a point. But if it was just because that form of worship was too intrinsically identified with the pagan gods during the Old Testament period, right, such that Yahweh would inherently be identified with Baal within the Old Testament period, well, that's not really a problem for Christians, okay? They have a real guy who walked around, right, who was God, the image of the invisible God, and that he was actually a really good portrait model, right? Not an immaterial God walking around in a cloud of a big pillar of fire. No, he was a walking bloke. This, of old, God the incorporeal and unsubscribed was never depicted. But now, when God is seen clothed in flesh and conversing with man, I make an image of the God whom I see. I do not worship matter. I worship the God of matter, who became matter for my sake and deigned to inhabit matter, who worked out my salvation through matter. I will not cease from honouring that matter which works my salvation. I venerate it. Though not as God, I venerate, not worship. This comes to the point, what's the difference between veneration or revering and worship? The Greek word for worship had become highly specialised by this point to be used exclusively for God. This allowed iconophiles to identify that whatever they were doing, they were not worshipping through this. They were revering. Now, admittedly, it might look like worship. Like, for example, if they kissed an icon or something like that. But that was actually just a cultural expression of why the icon is valuable and important. John of Damascus argued that an icon is essentially a messenger, just like a Bible is a messenger. And how many of you take seriously when you've got a Bible nearby? You know, if some kid in your youth group takes takes a Bible and just chucks it on the floor, are you okay with that? Or does that make you get a little bit, hey, that's the word of God right there? Why? It's just a book. No, there's something else going on there, and that's kind of where they're coming from here. How a messenger is treated and received is an expression of how you feel about who sent them. Actually, the iconophiles went further than that, saying that the honour bestowed to an icon was passed on to whoever it represented. The Greek word for an icon, for a messenger is apostolos, and apostolos is also an ambassador. If we treated the US ambassador with disrespect, that would actually reflect badly on our relationship with America. Do you see that? So therefore, if we show disrespect to an icon, that actually, its apostolic function, its messenger function, its ambassadorial function, we're actually insulting the God who it represents, just like an ambassador represents. More than that, he argued that icons are doors, or windows, or portals. Now, they didn't live in the 20th century and the 21st century, so they didn't understand this metaphor, but I've checked it out with my Greek Orthodox brothers and sisters, and they like it. And that is, it's a Skype call. Okay? You don't look at an icon. You look through an icon, like a window. Okay? Right? When a church building is covered all around with icons, especially of saints, as any number of churches are, it is an eschatological experience. The gap between the heavenly and the earthly is destroyed, and all of heaven and earth are mystically worshipping God in a foretaste of eternity. So imagine you're having a worship service and you set up a whole row of Skype calls, and you're getting in people from all over the place. How many people are attending your church? Well, there's tons of them. They're just beaming in, right? Well, that's exactly what they think is going on with icons. They're beaming in St. Peter. They're beaming in St. Andrew. They're that kind of a thing. Finally, they argue that icons are beautiful, and they really are. Icons are beautiful and are thus meant to reflect, even refract, God's beauty to us. To deny icons became seen as denying that God is beautiful. Ultimately, John's arguments won the day, most emphatically at the Seventh Ecumenical Council in 787, the last time the whole church officially brought representatives together to sort out doctrinal issues. That council was entirely based around the issue of icons, and it emphatically supported them, emphatically demanded, pretty much demanded, that they needed to be a part of Orthodox Christianity and Orthodox spirituality. Eventually, the Empress Theodora officially and unequivocally restored icons on the first day of Lent some years later. And since that time, the day that happened is held as a festival every year in Eastern Christianity. And you know what that festival is called? The Triumph of Orthodoxy. All of this is to show that attempts to suggest that the Second Commandment led Christians to reject and destroy art, right, that's just not going to fly. We were certainly tempted to take that away, not least when confronted with an explicitly anti-artistic worldview like Islam. But in the end, we found profound, beautiful reasons for maintaining a passionate embracing of art. Finally, and this is when I get a little bit jabby, I want to come back to the atheist arguments that I've been dealing with. Right? The accusations that I was dealing with, that primarily that Christianity is anti-pagan and anti-art. I got to tell you, I would actually flip that around. I would suggest that when you actually look at it, atheism is far more susceptible to being anti-pagan and anti-art than Christianity ever has been. I'm not saying that it inherently is. I'm saying that it's very, very susceptible to being anti-pagan and anti-art. This is why I find it hilarious that they walk around saying those big, mean Christians, ragging on those pagan religions as if they were on the pagan religion's side, right? Okay? Let's just nip that in the bud for a second, right? Okay. If somehow there was a massive revival of Greco-Roman divine worship, like Zeus and Hera and everything just went bunta and everyone started worshipping them again, do you honestly believe that atheists would be celebrating that? Do you honestly believe that? Or do you think that they'd probably go out of their way to seek to destroy it like they destroy any other religion? Because here's the thing, it's a pagan religion. And they don't like religions that much, atheists, okay? Moreover, and this begins to lean to my second point, atheism, whenever atheism has seized power, they have made none of the attempts that Christianity has to integrate the characters of those Greco-Roman narratives into the public consciousness. Okay, Christians went out of their way to take Greco-Roman religion and revive it in terms of its ideals and its characters and its narratives and everything like that. They went out of their way. No one put a gun to their head and said, because they didn't have guns back then, but no one took a bow and arrow at their head and said, you must make sure. No, they voluntarily paid great artists to do that, to start painting Venus and stuff. Okay? Atheists have had a long time to start to integrate that kind of stuff, if they're that supportive of it. But you know what? They haven't. Okay? Short of Percy Jackson and the Disney Hercules movie, right? Atheists tend to ignore those classical narratives. Okay, there's one major exception more recently, and that's Wonder Woman. But, I mean, how long did we have to wait for Wonder Woman to make it onto the screen? Okay? Batman and... there were like 7 Batman films and around about 6 Superman films all over the space of 30 years before we ever got Wonder Woman on the screen. How much of that is because she's a woman? How much of that is because of all this Greco-Roman Spiro stuff? That's a fun little debate for another day. My point is, if they really thought poor pagan religion, they've had plenty of chances to revive it to this point, and they haven't. Why? Because it represents ideals. Okay. This leads into my second point, which is that atheism has not been great for art either. Atheism has not been real great for art, as is evidenced by much of the modern art movement. Okay? We have this, Marcel Duchamp, Fountain, right, from 1917. That's a urinal. Okay? Okay, that's a very widely recognised piece of modern atheistic art. And then we have this. This is Barnett Newman's On Aimant Vie from 1953. This sold recently for $43 million. $43 million. I don't have time to go through many more examples, but so much of modern art is, to be quite honest, crap. And just let me clarify, I don't mean that as a value judgment on it. I mean, literally, it's literally crap. It's actual feces. For example, this. Terence Coe's own feces. This is the artist Terence Coe's own feces plated with gold, which sold for $500,000. Look at that.
You might have a lot of gold on it.
You'd need to have a lot of gold for it to be $500,000, right? Okay? How did we get to this? Well, in the late 1800s, a group of French, largely atheistic artists, now called the Impressionists, fought against the established Academy of French Art, arguing that their standards had to be dismantled, that the standards that had been so rigidly applied to art to that point needed to be disregarded. Now, I want to stress that the Impressionists didn't go too far in that. They stayed actually quite, within reasonable bounds, breaking bounds in a fairly constructive way. And some of the best artists you could imagine, Renoir, Sisley, Monet, Manet, Pissarro, those kind of people, are all from that Impressionist school. But the thing is, they let the genie out of the bottle. Okay? The problem was the philosophy underlying the movement, something that would only accelerate as people took it to its logical conclusions. Art, guided by the philosophical hand of Christianity, had maintained that there is an ideal, that there is a real, that there is a standard by which things could be measured. You could measure beauty because there was beauty. There was a real beauty, and that was God. You could measure precision. You could measure these things. Okay. Outside of ourselves, this made it objective. God, the original artist, had created the world, and therefore, as the artist had created the world, he himself had set the standards by which it could be measured. Its beauty, its symmetry, and so on and so on. Thus, the Greek gods could represent the ideals of God as revealed in the best of nature, justice, heroism, but also beauty. Once atheism gained steam in the arts in the 20th century, it deconstructed the idea that there is an ideal. Because if there's no God representing that ideal, your ideals are merely a construct. And therefore, you're just making it up. Therefore, there are no objective standards. As such, standards become subjective. All traditional standards of what is good, quality art were frequently abandoned. Hence, it's sometimes hard to tell the difference between art by a well-known artist and my 3-year-old's finger painting I mentioned earlier. I mean, here, let's be kind. Now, don't look for a tick. There we go. Now, you might have actually seen the answer to this, but here's a picture. Now, is that a picture by a celebrated artist, or is that a picture by my 7-year-old daughter?
Your 7-year-old daughter could do better than that.
You're kind of sitting there going, I'm not sure, really. I'm not really sure. And that's kind of my point. You can't tell. Now, as it turns out, it is Cupcakes in Sun by my daughter this year. Now, clearly, the fact that you might have really struggled to know whether that was actually some great artist or whether it was my 7-year-old, right, clearly indicates that you're all uncultured barbarians, right? That's it. Or it could be because Jordan, my daughter, is an artistic genius, right? I'm not sure that she's that much of a genius that that's worth a couple of mil. Okay? And this is my point. Once you actually stop having clear standards by which you measure things, anything goes, right? And atheism always lends itself to deconstructing of standards because there can be no standard. And so therefore, who's to say that that's not good enough to be worth a couple of mil? Who's to decide that? And the market, that's about the best job you've got. But then we come back to that, 43 mil. Okay. Now, if I'd wanted to, I could probably get George to do pretty much something as good as that. It all starts to become a little bit how you spin it, you know? And that makes me a bit nervous, particularly when I'm comparing it to this, you know? Which shows greater appreciation of light, greater appreciation of precision, greater appreciation of... Come on. Or we could just go this. $500,000. Moreover, the purpose of art became an attempt, and actually this makes the point for me, right? Moreover, the purpose of art became an attempt to meet subjective standards, the eye of the beholder, most primarily in the form of shocking the beholder. Okay? Hence, scatological art. Scatological art is a thing. It's an entire genre within modern art. Right? You might also look at disturbingly violent or pornographic art. I know an art tutor at Adelaide University who was lamenting to me once that her tute cast, she just couldn't shock them anymore. They'd been so shocked by so many things that she'd show them stuff and they'd just go, whatever. Right? She was specifically lamenting, she'd realised this after showing them an art piece of a woman masturbating a horse. She had a photo, an artistic photo of a woman masturbating a horse, and the people didn't care. Now, you can kind of look at that from a variety of different angles, can't you? Like, that's where we've come to now? We've come from, like, Venus to masturbating horses now? Really? There are notable exceptions to this within the modern art movement. I mean, you got Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali was able to bend traditional motifs in art, yet still reveal magnificent skill and intricacy, such as this. I mean, this breaks so many of our standard views of how the world works. And the clock thing is a really big thing with Dali. It comes out all the time. You know, the way that it flops and stuff like that. It breaks the rules of what you expect a clock to do. Things like that. You know, it leaves you asking questions like, how's the clock ticking when it's flopped over like that? You know, things like that. It breaks standard rules. And yet, no one could deny the intricacy and the talent that is evident there in the way that he's painting. I mean, it's really impressive. Okay. Brilliant mind. Right. So there are exceptions. Oh, wait. Yeah, Dali was a Christian. Or at least he became a Christian. This is his crucifixion corpus hypercubus, right? And the hypercubus is just one example. Seriously, he went nuts on Christian stuff. He became a devout Catholic, and it became a major theme of his art. His wife, his favourite muse, is representing Mary in this photo, in this painting. Now look, it's the end of a talk, and I want to recognise that I'm probably being a little unfair, a bit reductionist, right? There are any number of great atheist modern artists who do work faithfully within classical parameters that are atheists and everything, and there's plenty of really bad Christian art out there. So on one level, I don't want to paint an unfair picture. But you have to ask the underlying philosophy, the ontology of an artist and what it drives them to. Does it drive them to excel, to represent standards that just, standards, or does it seek to deconstruct those standards and lend itself to a lack of appreciation of skill and things like that? Part of why Dali became a Christian was philosophy, theology, philosophy, right? He realised that standards were hard. They were really hard, but they were necessary for art to really be art. And those ideals, standards, values were best found, for him at least, in Christianity. Thanks. Yeah, so 787 was when Leo was fighting, and he was fighting against Saracens and things like that. The stuff with, I'd have to look at my notes again, okay, give me 2 seconds, I'll get my notes.
It doesn't really matter.
Yeah, but yeah, no, so the main iconographical debates, one of the reasons for that was because of the rise of Islamic militantism starting to actually encroach on traditionally Byzantine land.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So, that's a time that you didn't. So I thought it was linked with Constantine.
You said Constantine.
No. Okay,
sorry.
different Constantine.
Oh, okay.
So not Constantine as in Constantine the First.
Yeah.
When you're as awesome as Constantine the First, they name an awful lot of their emperors after him.
Okay.
So Constantine the Fifth.
Now I get it.
The persecutor. Yeah. So he's from like the 700s, 800s.
Who did he persecute?
He persecuted the iconophiles, the people who were venerating icons. So yeah. So he was a passionate iconoclast. Leo III, his dad, iconoclast. Constantine ramped that up a bit. Constantine the Fifth.
So he was an Orthodox leader or a Rome?
No. He was Orthodox through and through.
Right.
He was a
Leo Rome or
no. Leo III. I mean,
that was before the schism.
Yeah, so Leo, the other thing is there's lots of Leos.
Yeah.
And popes do Leos, the Greeks do Leos, but no, so Leo the Third that we're talking about here is Emperor of Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire, Leo the Third,
right.
from like 7...
So is Emperor not a bishop?
No, he's an Emperor.
Right.
Yeah, sorry if that wasn't clear. So, but even then, you have to understand that, like, the Emperor of the Greeks in Constantinople was a highly religious figure. One of his official titles was equal with the apostles. Yeah.
And you're talking about the original Constantine in 300?
No, I'm talking about the Constantine V.
Later.
Right? So Constantine V,
yeah.
I'm doing that because it's a V.
Yeah.
But that's Roman.
Yeah, it's not really helping. Okay, so I'll go with that. Constantine V, from like the 800s and that, iconoclastic emperor who at the same time was a deeply religious figure, right? Because the emperor was a religious figure by that point. Now, to be fair, Constantine I had established that kind of a pattern. Yeah. He himself had tried to set it up that he was equal with the apostles. Famously, he built the Church of the Apostles in Constantinople as one of his first major renovations, and he'd actually set it up so that his mum would be able to find the remains of all 12 of the apostles, and there was a 13th, and they were all put in his...
It was Hagia Sophia.
No, Hagia Sophia is a little later, it's built over the top of it. Anyway, so like there's the 12 graves for the apostles, and he put all of the different relics from each of them. Yeah. And he had a 13th one, and the 13th one was for himself. And that was to establish that he was equal with the apostles, and subsequently all emperors took that title as well. So, when you get to Constantine V, then he's demanding that the church abandon icons. That's not just a secular leader doing that. That's actually a religio-political leader. Yeah. So,
thank you.
No worries.
Is the majority of the church are Catholic and Orthodox? Was there much that actually came out of the Reformation? And also, I've heard that the Catholic art was modified in post-Reformation as well.
Okay, that's a fun question. Let's talk about it first of all in terms of Protestant art. Part of the issue, one of the reasons why the Reformation took place was because of things like the Sistine Chapel. That I mentioned that Bernini, I think
Bernini.
Yeah. So when I referred to Bernini, he was paid by the Medicis. Yeah. Well, one of the Medicis that everyone kind of is famous is another Leo, and that's Leo X, Pope Leo X. Who was the main guy that Luther didn't like. And why didn't he like him? Because he was asking for indulgences. And why was he selling indulgences? The reason he was selling indulgences was to pay for the building of things like the Sistine Chapel. And so that meant that central to the thing that the Protestants were saying about what was so shocking about these people was they spent an incredible amount of money on painting pretty stuff. And they said, look, pretty stuff is okay, but not at the expense of the poor, where the poor have to give up their livelihoods just so you can have a pretty building in Rome get stood on. And so what that meant was that when the Protestants were in the position where they could have started spending a nice pretty penny on that kind of stuff, they sure as heck weren't going to do it because that had been part of their shtick for getting the Reformation going in the first place. They didn't want people then going to them and saying, hey, how come you're spending all that money on that now? Now, having said that, Protestantism established quite an impressive corpus of art, primarily through woodcuts, which were effectively the kind of popular...
And the book illuminations and all that.
Yeah, so woodcuts were they were used in printing presses. And they were very simple art, compared, because they were black and white and stuff like that, they weren't as impressive, didn't cost as much as the fine kind of portraits and frescoes that we identify with Catholic art. Which means that a lot of historians haven't really bothered to look at them because art historians like pretty stuff. And the Protestant art is very interesting, but like in terms of its theological input and that kind of stuff. But in terms of its art as such, it's, you know, it's just not as pretty as, you know.
Right, Rembrandt was Protestant.
Yeah, but that's much later. So, you know, when we're thinking primarily of Reformation stuff, we're thinking like the 1500s and stuff, and so that the main art that you would identify with that period from a Protestant point of view is woodcuts, and that's just not pretty enough for
There's a
people
couple
to
of
notice.
things about it. One, it gets it across to the common person.
Yeah.
You know, you can distribute it so that people everywhere can. It's much more accessible.
Exactly.
Than some beautiful painting in a grand cathedral in one place. So it's getting into everyone's home right across the country and more countries. And the second thing is it's using the latest technology.
Yeah.
You know, it's.
To be honest, there's another facet to that, and that is they're aiming it at their crowd. And like, if they're aiming it to the German peasant isn't particularly sophisticated in he's not sitting there going, I love the subtext here of Descartes, or, you know, or whatever. Like, some of that art is quite bawdy, right? And quite, you know, for want of a better term, common.
Some of what art?
Some of the woodcuts and stuff like that the Protestants were using. I mean, Luther was famous for his fart jokes, right? And the art that we're talking about, the woodcuts and stuff, has a fairly common humour to it. You know, it's the kind of thing where you'll see a Catholic priest with a dog's head and his bare bum showing and stuff like that.
But he was contextualising.
Yeah, exactly.
At the time.
Yeah.
It's quite clever.
Yeah. Yeah.
As a reformer, he's moving away from all that expensive, and it was debauched in many ways. I mean, you showed that Venus one, but how do we not know that the guys were getting together to leer over all this nakedness that they then, were paying for, and they were all voyeurs paying loads of money. I don't think the art is as wonderful as what, if we look deeply into the skills were lovely, but the messages were not so good.
See, this is an interesting question. So part of it is, and historians always have to deal with this, of how much of that is intrinsically human and how much of that is modern day perspective or something like that. So with something like the Venus, okay, where there's a bare boob showing, and to be honest, like I went on Google Images today to start trying to get more pictures and stuff like that, and I went, I won't use that one. I won't use that one. I won't use that one because I just figured it'd be pushing the envelope of,
David.
Yeah, I didn't do that kind of stuff. So I take your point, and that, but at the same time, there's the other side of that we live in a culture that's very pornographic and that is used to thinking of women exclusively sexually when looking at the nude form, whereas in their culture, it's harder to tell whether that's what's going on. The thing is that within their culture, the thing of a beautiful woman isn't just the sexuality of the beautiful woman. It's that they genuinely thought that a woman's, naked form could represent beauty in a much more noble, asexual kind of way. And I know that sounds really hard to believe, right? But the question is it hard for us to believe that because there's no way that someone could think like that? Or is it hard for us to believe that because we are so culturally conditioned by a sexualised culture that we can't comprehend that, right? And that's a really interesting question to unpack.
Well, I don't think males change over the centuries. Sorry.
No, I can, and that's a legitimate approach. But like other people would disagree, and other people would say that, you know,
I reckon they're beautiful.
yeah, like that, you know, something like the Venus. I don't necessarily look at that Venus picture and say, I'd do it. You know, that kind of a thing, to put it really bluntly. I don't think I want to have sex with her, but I can look at it and actually appreciate it for the beauty of what they're trying to represent. You know, that kind of stuff.
We've got nearly an all-male
Yes,
group,
this is true.
so the opinion should come from some, a mix.
Yep,
Really.
I take that on.
Because
That's
I
very
think
true.
it was exploitative of women.
Okay.
And most of the artists in those days being men, probably just about all the ones that you went through.
Yep, that's true. But if it's exploitative of women, the other side of that is that there are lots of nudes of men in that as well. And sure, some of the artists were gay necessarily, but not all of them. And some of them actually saw the beauty of...
Michelangelo was gay.
Yeah, Michelangelo was, and that kind of thing.
And so, you're presenting it as being, this was all beautiful, skillful and beauty, but some of these guys were.
Some, but not all.
Debauched.
Yeah,
No,
some.
I know.
I'm not denying that.
Yeah.
Some of
So
them.
they're kind of like doing the male as well.
Yeah, that's true. But again, some, not all.
I'm being the devil's advocate here.
Yeah, I know. I take what you're putting on. I guess I'm aware of that, and I can see that that's a facet of it.
It's
but
sort of like part of your argument, though, that I do think needs to come in. I know that your argument is, did Christians do these terrible things to art and dislike art? And then you go to sort of prove that, Christians didn't. It needs something else to sort of qualify some things that...
If what you want to do is you want to say that, if you want to nuance the argument and qualify it by saying that it's not the only thing that was going on, that's certainly true. But there are plenty of paintings that aren't of nudes that represent the ideals that we're talking about. And those ideals aren't always beauty per se, they're actually ideals of kindness, compassion, justice, love, gentleness, self-sacrifice, things like that. And those aren't done with sexualised men or women. And also, a fun little chicken and the egg kind of question as well is that sometimes they actually show violent scenes of exploitation. Now, is that them saying, in a voyeuristic way, we think this is wrong, but we're going to watch anyway because it's kind of hot to look at a woman being raped or a man being beaten up or something like that. You could either go that way, or you could go the other way and say that what they're trying to do is actually get people to wrestle with the dangerous aspects of our humanity, and to say to people, listen, if you go down that line of becoming, over-sexualised, this is where it could end up, and that would be really dangerous. Move away from that.
But could it be that they are looking into the spiritual realm, what is actually there? We hear about angels, we hear about these spiritual beings. We can't see them. Who's the devil's advocate who comes into our minds to destroy us? Are they trying to portray some of this stuff?
Well, they are, Sam.
Yeah, into their pictures, so that this is what we see. Today we don't see that in our church. We don't see it anyway.
Yeah.
And therefore we're void of that. But there is something there that needs to be also looking at.
That's a very good point, Stan, and I'll tell you why that's particularly interesting. The main place within Protestant circles where you're seeing a massive increase in art, like really skyrocketing in terms of artistic expression and paid, because that's the real kicker, paid artistic expression is actually within Pentecostal circles. So the one painting that I, as a Philistine as I am, the one time that I've actually paid for a painting was from one of my students. And she was from the Pentecostal tradition. And her art is actually an expression of Pentecostal worship. So the reason why she paints is because she'll go into a church and she feels that she has a kind of prophetic gift in her painting that allows her to express as part of worship what's going on. And this is big in all kinds of circles within Pentecostalism. And part of what they're trying to identify is the very point that you're making, the spirituality that's undertoned, both in terms of angels, but also the demonic, and trying to name that and paint that again. And so you're right, within the more rationalistic elements of, say, evangelicalism or something like that, where we tend to be rather squeamish about that kind of thing, you haven't seen that kind of flourishing of art. But certainly within Pentecostalism, where they're quite happy to embrace that and explore that, they're going into art in a really big way. And again, they're paying people to do that.
In Orthodox iconography, a lot of the pictures are not realistic; they're more abstract.
Yeah.
Is this actually to kind of encourage the look through?
Yeah.
About it?
There's a few things with that. Part of it's the idea that we look through the glass dimly. I have to admit that I am a Western Baptist trying to articulate another culture's spirituality. And I'm trying to do that fairly, but it's very hard to articulate that. And so when they have these kind of very, trying to think of a better word, extreme representations of figures in iconography, part of what they're trying to do is to try to show that we will not all die, but we will all be changed. To quote 1 Corinthians 15, that what we will become will be so much grander and bigger and more beautiful than anything else. Within the Catholic tradition, I went to a conference a little while ago where one of the people who was speaking, she was looking at reliquaries. So reliquaries are traditionally boxes where you put the relics of a dead saint or something like that. But what she'd done, she'd found reliquaries that were very popular during the medieval period. The reliquaries had, they weren't actually boxes, they were busts. They were heads and stuff. And she made the point, and she found it very awkward to have to say it, but she said, "Gosh, they're hot." Like, that's the direct quote that she used. She said, "Gosh, these guys, the heads of these guys, they're all very handsome." And she said, and she was asking the question, right, why did they make these guys look so great? Almost otherworldly in their perfection. That was because they are otherworldly. What they were trying to convey was that the relics inside are waiting for the resurrection. And what will we see at the resurrection when Jesus comes back and we are fully transformed into who we are going to be? They're not going to be a bunch of dead bones anymore. They're not going to be who they were. They're going to be who they are for all eternity, and that's going to be far greater and better than anything that we've ever been. It was the use of such outlandish beauty in the busts that they were doing, right, was to try to convey to people a central facet of the Christian hope. It was a really fascinating talk to look at and listen to. Yep.
I went to an exhibition of Renaissance art in Canberra 5 or 6 years ago, and what struck me and some of the other people there was that all the baby Jesuses were ugly. What's that about?
Yeah, see, that's an interesting...
The Mary was often quite pretty. That was often the artist's current mistress or whatever. But all the baby Jesuses were ugly. And it wasn't just my opinion, because I was talking to women there who had made the same comment and looked at it all and said, what's going on?
Yeah, that's an interesting phase within Renaissance art. And part of what they're trying to wrestle with there is the kind of Isaiah 53 stuff, you know, where like...
He wasn't much to look at.
He's not much to look at, you know. So there are phases within Renaissance art. There are other times where they make Jesus like be really great looking and stuff like that. And there are times where they bring out a certain ugliness. I mean, I showed you Grunewald's thing. Grunewald went out of his way to make the Jesus within that portrait incredibly disfigured and ugly. You know, if you get the chance, go on, look at, you know, Grunewald's crucifixion. And one of the things that people will often do is they'll focus in, and you can just look at the picture of Jesus's feet, and they are mutilated and twisted and like they're just horrible. Or to look at his face and like it's beaten and mashed up and stuff like that. And part of what he's trying to convey there is a reaction against the tendency to have a Jesus who's sitting on the cross looking like, you know, he's just coming out of a photo, you know, model photo shoot. You know, what they're trying to say is, no, there's an ugliness to Jesus, and that's actually part of the point, is that he isn't beautiful. You know, he stands alongside and with those who are you know, ugly and broken by the world's standards and things like that. So, like, I mean, if you went 50 years down the track or 20 years or whatever, you'd probably find that there's a reaction the other way within Renaissance art where Jesus is back to being a nice, cute little baby, you know, cherub cheeks and that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
It depends what date it was.
Yeah.
Some of the, like in Giotto,
Yeah.
It was sort of like the early Renaissance. It's quite, the images are quite naive in some ways, you know. So it depends on the date, but it certainly developed towards the mid, that time where it was high Renaissance. They sort of had it pretty well. Beauty was the thing, wasn't it, really? Yeah.
One event that's kind of stood in my memory is we went on a Western European tour and we visited Lucerne, and there's a big wooden bridge across the lake, and we're walking across it, and one guy and me walked into this church, and his reaction was when he walked in, he said, "Oh my God," with the beauty of it. And like it's like should Christian art have that effect in terms of exhibiting beauty and be a representation of highest aspirations in art?
Well, that's a really good point, and it comes out again if we go to the Orthodox with the Hagia Sophia. So the Hagia Sophia was a church in Constantinople. So Constantine organised the Church of the Apostles. Justinian, who was a later emperor and not to be outdone, he made a much larger version of that, including a massive dome that was 50 metres off the ground, as you do in the 600s. Just ridiculous. Gold mosaics and everything like that throughout there. And coupled with the liturgy and the music and the worship and everything like that, visitors, you know, to Constantinople who went to the Hagia Sophia, particularly during worship, they argued that was one of the things that converted them to Jesus. You know, a lot of the time was just walking into the sheer beauty of this and saying, this is as close to heaven as I'm going to get. This is it, and I want to be in this kind of a place for the rest of eternity, so I'm in, you know, that kind of a thing. So the actual impact of a beautiful Christian building can't be underestimated. In fact, just last year, maybe even this year, a report came out that in England, surprisingly, there's something like 1 in 6 kids who are actually genuinely exploring Christianity and coming into churches and becoming Christians and stuff like that. It's a really interesting dynamic. And when they asked why one of the central reasons most frequently given by these kids was I walked into a Christian building and it was so beautiful I wanted to find out more. The buildings actually themselves were evangelistic, because even if Protestants...
So the architecture...
The architecture and that kind of stuff was itself so beautiful that they went, anything that created something this beautiful, I'm willing to explore it. Which is a bit messy for us Protestants, you know, because us Protestants want to say that if we just sat down and told them the gospel, then they just go, well, snap. They wouldn't waste their time with any of these pesky buildings. We're building, you know, we're turning old sheds and stuff like that into churches. You know, there's been an entire architectural movement over, say, the last 20 or 30 years in Protestantism to not have anything pretty in your church building. And that's just flying in the face of the reality of kids in England.
I wonder if we kind of lost that aim that Christianity should be producing the best art.
Yeah.
The best science.
Oh, categorically.
Best philosophy.
Yeah.
That's all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I don't want to dominate.
No, it's fine.
Yeah. But just leading on from what you're saying there, I've been involved with Aldgate Baptist Church, and I've been their curator for probably the last 10 years. We've had some super art exhibitions. Quite a Hills people are creative, they write and they make things, and it's been a battle, really. You just really know that the ordinary person that belongs to the congregation are not sure at all what on earth are you doing. Mm-hmm. You're having these meetings and you've got a theme and you're all working. You've got a team of artists all working to it. But when it gets up and running, they do love it, but they don't hardly buy it, or they don't want to take it home. Christian artists, really battling with their own congregation, and it gets back to your talk. Do Christians really appreciate art? Yeah, I think that's a really good point, and again, it comes back to that Protestant suspicion about that. I will say, you mentioned Aldgate. I also mention
Mount Barker does.
Mount Barker. They're really big in the prophetic art.
Which group is that?
Mount Barker Baptist. So within the Baptist community in Adelaide, there is this shift. So Mount Barker, Aldgate, as you mentioned. The other one that comes to mind is, what's the one for the poor and the underprivileged in the city? Westcare.
They have
Westcare.
don't they?
Yeah, Westcare.
In your own
For the Aldgate Baptist one?
The Aldgate Baptist.
Oh, I'd love to do that.
Yeah. So it had four over a period of 6 years, So.
And I will say, the other thing about Aldgate is passionately, connected to the Reformation. I was up there a little while ago preaching about the Reformation. Mark and Kurt and the rest of the crew up there, very passionate on that. But, from the sound of things, they're also, quite supportive of the kind of stuff that you're doing.
Yeah.
And which is really wonderful to see.
I think we've gone over time as it is, so we better call it off there, and you can talk to Matt afterwards if you like.